We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Jane McAlevey. She is a labor activist and author of No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. And Jane, welcome to the show. We were just talking before we started to record that I was saying it really, I guess, is the new Gilded Age, but you were anticipating where we are today as opposed to maybe where we were 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, well, and I even said, first of all, it's lovely to be here. It's great to be on your show. It actually always is. So I think when I wrote the title of the book, it was partly because it was clear to me that we were heading back to a Gilded Age. It's been feeling right from the crash of 2008 to high rollers on Wall Street to messing with the entire economy and not caring to, crashing the value of every working person's retirement plan by crashing, by the mortgage crash that we had. There's like a disregard that's been palpable and rising for the masses of the workers in our country. And by the masses, I mean like 90% of people, right? There has been this, you can see in the Peter Thiels and the Jeff Bezoses, in that you can feel a sort of a return to a 1920s style country. So to me, it's been obvious that it's coming. And sadly, I feel like it is actually here. Oops, one sec.
So we've spoken about Janus v. AFSCME, I think at least a couple of times. We've been anticipating this case in some respects for really the past couple of years because first version was Friedrich's, similar issue at hand, and then and Scalia decided to leave his bodily form and leave the ability for public sector unions to easily fund themselves, at least their what the work they were doing for their members. And but now we have Neil Gorsuch, and we have this new case, Janus v. AFSCME. Just, like I say, I think this audience is pretty familiar with it, but just sum up what the case was. And it was decided yesterday, right before Kennedy retired. But just sum up the case for us.
Sure. I mean, at the most simple level, I say look at Donald Trump's tweet from yesterday about this, where he says, lots of money will be taken out of the coffers of the Democratic Party. Terrific ruling. I mean, that sort of sums up what the purpose of the case was in his own presidential tweet. But what the case did was it said essentially, if you belong to a public sector union, meaning a teacher, firefighter, anyone who works at any level for any form of government at the state, county, local level, you can no longer be you can no longer pay what's called an agency fee. So it's Byzantine. Let me just say it this way. Since 1977, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Abood, made a decision that in the public sector, workers who work for the government would not have to pay union dues. But there was a compromise in 1977 which said, look, the truth is we have a system called exclusive representation. Every worker has to be represented by the union no matter what. But there's a compromise if they feel like their political values are different than their unions. For example, like who the union endorses in political races. A worker should not be forced to support the political objectives of a union if they disagree. That's 1977. Let's just say I feel like that was the golden age right about now. But anyway, back in 1977, the court ruled there's a formula that we've all had to play with a bit. There's a formula that they issued that you essentially deduct how much money goes to politics and advocacy work, and you come up with about 70. It averages about 75% of a worker's dues, called an agency fee. And the agency fee, though, is something that if there's a union in the facility, then a worker can choose not to be a member of the union, but they must pay what's called the agency fee, right? So they're paying for like the service, the representation, the benefits of collective bargaining. So that was called an agency fee. And that's been settled law, as we used to think of the law, the former concept of settled law, which we're about to rip up entirely right now, right? But so the concept of, that being settled law, by the way, like Roe v. Wade, like many other things that they're about to rip up. So this is just, one of many. So sorry about that. Hang on just one sec, or should I just keep talking through it? All right. So
just keep talking. We know you're in an airport. That's fine.
Okay. All right. So I thought I didn't come into this room. But anyway, so essentially that was 1977. And what they did yesterday, technically was sort of say that the agency fees can no longer be charged. The problem is, in the way they did the ruling, there's a lot of danger that floats around this ruling. So first of all, what was the point? The point was to facilitate, the next Gilded Age, really. The point was to take us back to the 1920s, to be perfectly honest. That's where they're going. The Lochner era. I mean, they're taking the goal of the people who took this lawsuit. This was funded principally by the Uline family. I don't know if your listeners know much about them. It's good to go Google them, right? And I tweeted yesterday, I included a good New York Times piece that gave a breakdown of the primary funders of the case. So, for anyone to think this is some innocent guy who's didn't like his union. I mean, it's, horse crap, right? This is a very strategically engineered case. Friedrichs was the first round. Harris v. Quinn was the first round. It goes back to Knox v. SEIU. I mean, they have been doing to labor law what they're doing to the Voting Rights Act. And they're doing it on a parallel track, which is like every session, they engineer a case that's going to challenge some part of the Voting Rights Act, some part of affirmative action, some part of labor law. And it's been death by 1,000 cuts, but some cuts are much deeper. And this cut was to the jugular, right? So that's the decision that they made yesterday. But what they had to do, because public sector law is different than private sector labor law. Private sector labor law is governed by the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. So this did not cover private sector workers, which we know are down to about 6% of the workforce, right? So who they were going after, they were taking their aim at, very strategically, they were aiming at where there are still large numbers of workers and unions, at the power and financial base of the trade union movement, which is the only sector capable of advancing any kind of pushback on the billionaire class. So this is super strategic, really well thought through, really well planned, decades in the making. They've been going at it. So what's unique is that under public sector labor law in the United States, it's not governed by the NLRA. It follows a lot of the same ideas laid out in the National Labor Relations Act, right? But public sector laws are governed state by state. So, of course, you have these state rights guys just eviscerating state rights, by the way, right, at the same time. So they literally, these are the black robes of the states' rights people, except when it comes to workers' rights, right? So they throw states' rights out. They engineer the case to call it a First Amendment case so that they can create national decisions about a states' rights issue fundamentally, which is public sector labor law, which has always been governed at the state level. So they knew what they could not do was mess with unions in states like New York, California, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, New Jersey, all of the states where unions are still strong, where we have better benefits, where workers have better lives, where we have rent control, where, where the climate is better for the working class. They knew that the Democratic-leaning states, the so-called blue states, would never gut unions in the way that the, more conservative states did long ago. And so they had to strategically engineer a case that could take what has always been a states' rights issue and make a national decision to gut the financial power of the working class in this country. And that is what they actually just did. Now, it's not the end of unions. It is not, I certainly don't believe that. But if you think about the immediate cycle, now to 2018 elections, they just blew a hole in the financial resources available to not just unions. It's the financial resources available to the Democratic Party, in essence.
Right. Because what's happening, just if I could, what's happening, and my understanding is I think maybe it was SEIU was already pulling back funding in anticipation of losing and nobody knows for sure how much revenue they're going to lose because it's an opt-in type of situation. And my understanding, it's also there was also elements of Alito's. I think he is the one who wrote the opinion that will also raise the bar for the opt-in process. That it's going to make it even harder than just a decision, but it's going to be that much harder for people to I guess avoid the enticement of a free rider situation. Now, let me ask you this. So yes, it's going to starve resources from the Democratic Party. It's going to starve resources from the any of the operations of the unions. And they're going to need some time to sort of like readjust and have confidence who's going to pay these fees going forward, I guess. And so that now is the time not to spend any money. It's to find out how much they're going to have in terms of revenue. But, let me just ask you this. I got a message from a postal worker the other day who said, we're basically an open shop, but we find that in the context of the way that we work, it's pretty hard for people to avoid paying their fair share because there's a considerable amount of pressure. How much of the future is going to be a function of that when we talk about unions? Or how much is it going to be a function of the unions reforming and changing the way that they do business? And what's your take on both?
So a couple of things. One is, yes, the postal workers. So in 2003, the lovely old George Bush Jr. there, W, he did this already to the federal workers, sort of on the heels of the Patriot Act. He just snuck it in there. So most people don't understand that all federal employees were sort of forced into right to work back in 2003. So that's, and that's what I mean by the death by a thousand cuts. And there's been a series of executive orders, by the way, if we have time, we should get back to, that were also just issued by Trump several weeks ago, that are the next devastation to the federal employees. So we could come back to them. But so postal workers, right, they've been living under the system since 2003. So have all the federal workers unions. I would say a few things. One is, the postal workers have very good leadership right now. So congratulations, good job electing good, smart, progressive leadership. And that's part of the message here. If you have, visionary, smart, and let me use the word small d democratic, high participation, trade union, you're going to survive this. You're going to survive it, but somebody say, well, that's an argument to do it. No, it's not an argument to do it. We need good unions anyway. But the idea that people are going to, by the way, it's immediate. The law goes into effect immediately. There's no transition period. So even the next human resources all over the country is going to be going crazy, in the next week, trying to figure out, there's going to be a lot of money immediately gone. Then it's an opt-in system. So yes, we'll survive it. And look, the best evidence that we're going to survive it, and we can, if we do our work right, continue to lead the fight back in this country, which is what labor has long done, is looking at West Virginia, right, and Arizona, and Oklahoma, and North Carolina, and all the states where we saw the most incredibly beautiful militant struggle this year in the streets, putting real pressure on, winning things themselves, for themselves and their families and their communities. They also live already under these rules, right? So I say to people, look at what happened in West Virginia. They already existed under right to work law. They already didn't have agency fee. They don't even really have the right to collective bargaining in the same way that people in sort of so-called Democratic leaning or blue states do. So when 34,000 workers in West Virginia decided, we're not going to wait for political solutions. We're just going to walk off and try and fight for our health care and fight for a raise and stop charter schools and stop privatization and everything else they did. And they won. So in the happy, positive news department, we need a lot more of West Virginia. And I don't mean that kiddingly, I mean that for real.
And just to clarify, when we're talking about these states, we're talking about teachers, and we've covered that. But teachers always seem to me to be best situated to leverage their labor in these circumstances, because on day one, and they have already developed deep ties with the community because of the nature of their work, right? As a parent, exactly. I know I want access to my teachers all the time, and I'm going to develop a relationship with the teachers of my children, and there's immediately I'm an ally of theirs. With my sanitation worker, or with the guy who works on fixing the street, I don't talk to those guys. I don't, I may say hi and this and that, but I don't have a personal connection. How do unions develop a similar relationship with the community that teachers have, as like part of their, as part of their job on some level?
Yeah. So, one, you're right. And by the way, postal workers, similarly, like people actually like their postal workers generally. They know them. Postal workers. I mean, I'm going out on a limb here because I don't actually have a statistic in front of me, but I think the postal service has been one of the most impressive sources of employing African Americans and African American women in this country. So, there's a solidarity that runs deep for a lot of reasons in the postal service, right? They see each other all the time. They've got, sort of fixed schedules. They build relationships. And a lot of them still do know their community in the same way that you're expressing about your teacher. And certainly in No Shortcuts, right, in my second book, I talk specifically about that there will need to be strategic sectors going forward to build a new labor movement as they're coming at us. And I say, right, I argue for several chapters, like it's going to be healthcare workers and education workers who are mostly women, a lot of people of color, and who have profoundly deep relationships organically to their communities, right? So I'm super in agreement with you that this is like where we have to go. Now, the question is, so what if they have less relationship? What do they do? What I practice as a negotiator and an organizer, and what I write about as an author and theorist, is something called whole worker theory. And by that, I mean, when I'm working with workers in a big campaign, the first thing we have to do is understand the power relationships among and between the workers at work. So that's like task one if you're an organizer, like who leads who, who's the most trusted worker, whose opinion will other workers follow if they're nervous or scared when the boss starts, bearing down on them in either a unionization drive or in a tough contract fight. And it's essentially doing what I call power structure analysis among and between ordinary workers in the workplace. Part two of that work, to survive right now and for us to push back against the coming end of the entire New Deal, which is straight where they're going. These guys are not messing around. So let's come back to that. But what you have to do to build more strategic relationships from all workers is you have to secondarily begin to chart. And by chart, I mean literally chart, like in one-on-one conversations, rank and file led, like I train workers to do it with each other. So they go out and they say, let's make a social survey of every single person in the community that our family is connected to, our church, our little league, our soccer club. If they're not education workers, their kids' school, their PTA. Like we systematically start to chart the social relationships that the workers themselves hold in the community. Then we begin to bring the workers together across big workplaces in a, geography, any given, or, a state, a locality, wherever I'm working. And we say, now you're going to go, and that takes a while, right? It's painstaking work to begin, and people, it's like, it's a serious organizing conversation. People are like, what do you want to know, where I go to, what my church is, or my synagogue, or my whatever. So, it's based on a trusting relationship. And then people can really do this. And, we did it again in the big 2016 campaign I was running. So, and then instantly you begin to see where does the worker base itself already have well-trusted, well-developed relationships in their community. So it's actually a systematic, methodical approach to structuring and building deep relationships between workers into the community because they've already got it. So most unions just don't get this step of the workers
identifying
don't
what assets already exist in terms of relationships.
Yeah.
All right. So,
yeah. Like they do these top down, we're going to build a labor community coalition. And it's like the union leader goes and writes a check to some community group.
Right.
And that's so much weaker than realizing
where it already exists organically.
There.
Yeah, I get that. And that, all right. So let me ask you this. That's the perspective I would take if I would go in and I'm working with unions and I would say, look, the step is let's assess. I mean, that's, if someone was to come in and look at my business, that's the first thing that they would do too. I think they would say, let's see how many hits you're getting on YouTube. Let's see how many, where is the most fertile grounds for opportunity to expand the reach of your show. Not like I have a one size fits all for every show, despite what they're already doing. And so, but what do people who are listening to this show who aren't involved in a union, who don't have access to, suggesting, hey, even if it was amongst their union buddies, like let's map out where we have relationships and put it together and take a look at the thing and focus on building out from the existing assets we have. What do you do if you're just someone who's on the outside and you don't even, have a connection to a union? What is there anything that we can do to support that moment where, somehow we are touched by a union, or we are, asked to join a union on a picket line, or to engage in a protest? I mean, how do we apply these principles to a non-union context?
So I wrote an article years ago called Organizing Unions from the Outside In. And I want to draw a little bit on that idea of what you're speaking to. So the first thing I just want to say, because it really does affect everyone. Like the way you're describing that you've got plenty of listeners who are, most workers are not in union, right? So obviously most of your listeners are probably not in union either, because that's the country right now. So this ruling is absolutely going to affect every single listener listening to this. This decision was not about trade unions. This decision was about the big business billionaire class rolling back the final legs of the New Deal, by which I mean Social Security. They're closing like an office every several weeks right now. Like there's so much going on in the actual news every day by the distractor in chief that people don't even understand what they are doing every day. They are getting ready. Like this, I keep saying to people, this is not a decision about unions. It's a decision about corporate power. And their aim is to have small, tiny government, small, tiny worker organizations, and big billionaire corporate class businesses running this country. And they are talking about the 1920s. So I say to people hold on and get ready for the fight. So if you don't have a union yet, by the way, it's a hell of a time to try and build one. And I'm not kidding. As a reaction to this, people who don't have one, there's plenty of people listening who could form one. So one, start thinking about how to do it. Secondly, if you're, I was working with some pastors in Philadelphia a couple of years ago in a big campaign with nurses, and after we had built relationships through the workers themselves, there came a point when I remember going into a Sunday church, in this case a black church, where the minister packed about 7,000 a Sunday in, right? These are huge places. So black church, downtown Philadelphia. And I went in, it was after we won, and, the members of his congregation who were part of the union, because we built the connection that way, he was thrilled, by learning that unions were somehow still I remember him telling me, he remembered the civil rights movement and King and sanitation workers, but, he hadn't met, modern unions, right? No surprise. So there was a moment, fast forward, we win. The members of his congregation who had built the relationship between themselves and their new union formation and his congregation, he asked, me to come in. And I wouldn't go until the end. One, because I just was flat working 20-hour days at that point, right, trying to get the contracts done. But also because I feel very strongly that the relationship has to be held between the workers themselves and the community that they belong to. But so finally, it's over. That's the time when I usually say, okay, let's go meet these great pastors who are, coming on picket lines and speaking and preaching. And he called me up onto the in front of the whole congregation and said, everyone who has a union should meet her at the end of this. Everyone who doesn't have a union and wants one should talk to her. She's going to be in the back of the room. And for the rest of us, we need to figure out how to talk to her to build unions and support them. And it was, to thousands of black unorganized workers in Philadelphia. So people, if they're of faith, whatever your faith is, you should be going in and working with your religious leader and saying, why don't we make an announcement that it's time to start figuring out how to support working people, and ask everyone in the congregation to put their hands up. Like people can start to do the same kind of charting from the outside in, is my argument. Like, how do you support a union? So if you have a community of faith, you could do it the way I just described. Like, let's actively start saying, it's time, just like it's going to be time to stand up and support affirmative action, women's rights, the Voting Rights Act, black people, brown people, name it, fill in the blank. They are rolling the country back as fast as they can. So I think it's up to everybody to figure out and understand and see that this attack is on our democracy. It's on the republic. It's against our communities. It's against the entire country if you're not in the 1%. And so one is form a union. Secondly, PTA, Parent Teacher Association. And if you're a parent, walk into the school and say, I'm going to run for office in my PTA, and then make sure that your PTA is ready to stand there supporting your teachers, and not just the teachers, but all the education workers, right? The bus drivers, the cooks, all of them. Like it's that time, it is time for a level of solidarity building that we have not had in my lifetime. And there's no more time to wait. The level of urgency, especially with Kennedy's announcement, we just went to fire, like we're at a 4-alarm fire in this country, that with the Kennedy announcement especially, and what they did to unions and what they did, you can purge voting lists. It's gonna require a level of solidarity building and people deciding they're going to do one less fun thing, with the kids because they're going to bring the kids to an action. They're going to do one less, we're at the moment where we're about to lose the entire New Deal and most good things that came after the New Deal, unless and until people stand up in numbers that we haven't seen. And I'm not talking about going to the next protest. That is not what I'm talking about, right? Go to the next protest, that's fine. That is not how change is going to happen in this country. People have to walk into their parishes, their congregations, their synagogues, their PTAs, their community group, their soccer club, and start talking about, we need to support workers, we need to support unions, we need to actually be ready to stand up and act in our communities to defend each other. And that's already been true, right, of right. Latinos and undocumented people. So we just have to sort of say, they're coming to build internment camps. They're coming to roll us back to the 1920s. It's within everybody's power to start deciding locally in their communities how we're going to build community-based solidarity among and between people in our community and among and between the working class at the workplace.
Jane McAlevey, no shortcuts, organizing for power in the new Gilded Age. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Take care.
Thank you.